Willkommen in einem anderen Figurenspiel. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 36 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos. In this case I'll be covering game aids, or what game aids should you include, create or expect for your sets of rules or your game. One of the greatest objectives of a good set of rules is to offer the historical details required to keep players happy while being able to complete a game in a 3 to 6 hour time frame with a clear objective and a clear ending. While in the most part the length of the game is a simple maths exercise, game turns multiplied by the number of elements, other factors can influence this. One is the effort involved in executing a game turn. The simplest method of ensuring a game turn is completed quickly is to keep things simple. But then we often have to trade off historical accuracy. One way to mitigate this is to ensure players have game aids which make playing the game reasonably easy, even if there is embedded historical accuracy included. There are many types of game aids which you can employ, and in many cases they're influenced by the rules. So I'll first cover the common game aids all players could consider for all rules, and then we'll drill down into a single set of rules, or a set of rules, there's a group of rules, which have common issues and what specific game aids are employed for those rules. The best and most basic game aid is an easy to reference rules book. SBI used to create board game rules in a 8-point font in 3 columns, which was normally a maximum of 16 pages of standard rules and 2 to 4 pages of special rules. In many cases the rules were much shorter. But what this allowed for was a small document, or what this provided is a small document which could be easily cross-referenced during a game. This shows my version of a DBN which I use in my games. The rules component is 16 pages in length, and I find this format very useful in quickly finding fiddly rules. This is, of course, my own personal use, or for my own personal use, but it's something other players can do with rules which they find difficult to cross-reference. Other rules don't need this, so while they may not follow the SPI format, they are nonetheless very referenceable, such as the spearhead sets of rules. These rules require no homemade compressed reference rulebook to assist players, and it's very easy to quickly find that critical rule that you need to find during a game using spearhead rules. Of course, there are issues with 8 points in 3 columns, as this may be rather hard to read for gamers who are aging. 2-column versions may suffice, as this example of the old Core Commander shows. Again, this is my personal copy of Core Commander, and I reformatted in this form so I could actually reference things more effectively. Incidentally, Spearhead uses the 2-column method, and this is a good compromise for those who have eyesight issues. There are other solutions apart from the 2-column solution. Some rules are so simple and they're presented in a small form factor that it also achieves the same objective. This is an old copy of Anabasis, which was printed in a small A5 format and consisted of 38 pages of rules. It was very easy to find critical rules in this particular rules book, and it was an excellent referenceable rules book. But whatever solution is selected, it greatly assists if the rules book is small enough to be by your side in a game and easy enough to quickly reference that all-important rule. However, in many cases it's not possible to make your rules into a referenceable game aid for your game due to lack of time, difficulty converting it into a referenceable format, or a game system that's simply too complex. No matter what you do, it's going to be too complex to create a referenceable version of the rules. In these cases, a cheat sheet is useful, which can also be useful if you have a referenceable rules book by your side, but is absolutely essential if you don't. Now, in some cases, the cheat sheet is actually embedded in the rules book, as can be seen in this copy of Anabasis. However, in most cases, it was a separate sheet. SBI board game rules would include a charts and tables section in their rules, which was normally a double-sided A4 or can extend to 4 pages, which was in most cases a separate sheet of paper you could keep by your side. This shows the basic format, but it's my cheat sheet, or charts and table sheets, for the old Corps Commander sets of rules, which is a set of rules that is extremely complex and desperately needs as many game modes as possible in order to play effectively. While the SPI system works quite well, it's probably better if the game aid is something a bit more substantial or unusual. In this case, what we have is a double-sided sheet of thick cardboard or thick paper, and this example is from the WRG 7th edition rules. In most rules, most rules have cheat sheets of some description, but their design may also not be optimal. In this case, it's a good idea to create your own. However, a lot of rules don't have a cheat sheet, and it's really critical that you sit down and really think long and hard how to create your own cheat sheet in order to A, learn the rules, and B, to be able to teach the rules and play a game in a short period of time or with minimal effort. The purpose of a quick reference sheet or cheat sheet is to allow a player to avoid referencing the rules while playing. This example from Figurenspiel, which is a reformatted version of LWRS, contains everything a player would require to play a game, ranging from sequence of play, movement rates, combat charts, and any special charts required. A really useful cheat sheet is one which a game can be played from without ever referencing the formal rules. This does not obviously include setup and victory conditions, as they're pretty much specific to a scenario and deserve their own cheat sheet. The design is also very important. When creating this, I was forced to place the critical hit and save values in big font at the top, as I was always getting them mixed up. While an optimal cheat sheet should only be a single double-sided sheet of paper, in complex game systems where elements have specific specs, you may need to create a separate cheat sheet for these specifications. The sheet on the right provides the combat values of the Polish elements in this particular set of rules and allows for a player to quickly verify the values of those elements when combat occurs. It also applies to movement, etc., and any special rules relating to the element. In simpler game systems, this may not be required, as with Napoleonics, for example. But for World War II or Cold War, there was a lot of different weapon systems and their values could differ greatly. The sheet on the left is a scenario setup sheet. While not required to play a game, it does speed up scenario setup greatly and is also something very useful to get through your game in a quick period of time. We'll discuss this in more detail later. Now, if we're very fortunate, a single cheat sheet can contain everything required for a game as well as the unique troop types. This is a cheat sheet from a figure game version of SPI's pre-stag rules, which in this case uses DBMM troop types. Everything required can fit on a single double-sided cheat sheet in this case. I have seen rather good DBMM cheat sheets similar to this as well. The most important game aid is a cheat sheet. However, some rules do require you to keep track of game turns or other game system functions such as demoralization or panic levels. This example from a figure game version of SPI's Napoleon at War has a game turn track on the left and an army panic level track on the right. While this can be tracked with pen on paper, it's clearer and easier to keep track on a track with counters or even dice. Scenario game aids tend to be an area overlooked in rules. Even if playing points-based games, you may need a scenario sheet which allows you to quickly identify your force mix, deploy terrain and deploy your forces. While you can do this by referencing the rules, it's easier to have something simple to reference when setting up. If playing a historical scenario, this is even more important. This shows the Wagram scenario for a figure game version of Napoleon at War. It clearly shows all deployment, reinforcements and victory conditions as well as terrain position. In historical games, the figure gaming playing area setup can be a major issue. The sheet on the right allows players to understand the terrain required for the playing area. While this may often not be duplicated identically, at least you have an idea of where the main terrain is, and using your modular flexible terrain pieces, you can reproduce it. Anything which helps players to quickly set up the playing area and set up the forces speeds up the game and is a very good thing. One other good game aid is creating a ruler which is specific to the rules you're playing. DBA, DBN and DBM, as well as DBMM, have templates which can assist players in creating rules which can be used for movement and missile fire. The idea is to include common rules on the ruler. This example from a figure game version in the Napoleon at War, shows base widths from 1 to 7 along with the troop types which move these distances. The red arrow indicates artillery range. With this, there is no need to reference a unit's movement allowance and no need to use a tape measure or a ruler which is not matched up with your rules. This ruler template is glued on a piece of, let's say, pine wood, which is the required length, or you could alternatively glue it on a piece of cardboard. I normally use a piece of pine wood which is 1.2 centimetres square, and it works quite well. And my template has 4 faces, which you could, if you wish, contain different information, but in my case I tend to just have the same information. There are a lot of other game aids which are highly rules dependent, but when playing a game, or once you understand a game, you quickly identify the kind of game aids which can speed up movement. So in this particular example, this block that you can see here, which is used for a figure game version of the Napoleonic War, is used to identify movement zones of control and also movement in some cases, such as retire 1 base width, and you can actually create by just simply cutting out pieces of timber of the appropriate size and painting accordingly. Now, in this case, it's a bit messy. I plan on using 3mm bases of the correct size, 2 deep, and then just a much smaller piece of wood sticking out of it. But it doesn't really matter. Something like this actually assists players in, fiddly manoeuvring rather than getting out tape measures and arguing about this is possible and that's not possible, etc. For those interested, this shows how they're used. As you can see, it can get rather crowded, and a game aid such as this can ensure units have the correct spacing according to the rules. This can also allow the phasing player to avoid enemy movement zones of control when it's moving around. Other rules could use something like this to, let's say, mark out missile range, etc. That is, rules which don't have the concept of zone of control. Now, movement trays could also be counted as a game aid, allowing players to move more than one element together. This depends obviously on the rules, and I must admit movement trays do have a negative bling impact, but they do speed up play dramatically if the rules support it. To give you an example, I recently played a version of a scenario of Figurenspiel where each side had 71 elements. Now, in most games, 71 elements would result in a game that lasts for 6 hours. However, because I use movement trays, and I must admit the rules, the Napoleonic War rules, are rather simple, I completed this game including setup and pack up, in 3 hours. Now we come to the game aids I really dislike, but sometimes you have no choice. The counter, which indicates some game system state, which you need to be able to see. In this case, this indicates one of the units is active. Now, this top-down view shows some of the common counters which are used by many different sets of rules. Now, the counters here are for a PEX-based, it's the SPI pre-Stags game using figures. A common counter is the disorder counter. Now, in this case, I have to track first and second disorders, so the counters can be flipped to reflect this. But many rules have the concept of disorder or disruption, and you probably should consider making counters in order to mark this out. Another common counter is casualties. In this case, the counter has taken 1 hit, and this affects its command effectiveness, so to speak. Now, some rules don't have any hit or casualties, and in that case, that's a good thing. But many rules do have some form of hit or casualty requirement, and it's easier for you to mark this out on the playing area with a counter rather than recording it off the playing area. Now, this counter is an engaged counter. This basically means the unit's engaged in combat and cannot move. This is probably rather an esoteric counter and would only probably be applied to a set of rules like this. But there may be other rules that have this concept as well. Now we come to, and we're looking at a different set of rules in this case, orders. Now you can record orders on a piece of paper, which is really not a good thing because you simply forget what the orders are. Now, what we see here are attack orders and defend orders for these three units. Each unit consists of three elements. And players can clearly see that these units are under those particular orders. Now we come to something kind of similar to casualties, hits. This indicates the number of hits that unit has suffered. So in summary, while counters for rules do vary, there are a number of standard ones. Disorders, possibly second disorders, hits and casualties are fairly common, and probably orders. Now I print the counters out from a piece of paper and a laser printer or a dot matrix colour printer, glue it on thick cardboard and cut them out. It's important to use an appropriate colour, otherwise it will have a serious bling impact. And the colour I generally use for most non-critical counters is a type of green, as you can see here with the order counters, and something that's really important, a dark red. But make sure you pick colours which are sympathetic to your playing area. So even when you're forced to place these horrible counters out onto the playing area, at least the playing area remains looking good. Now let's drill down into the game aids which are required to start a game. This is specifically scenario details, which I've briefly touched on earlier. This is a scenario sheet for bloody big Napoleonic battle, in this case Ligny and Quatre Bras. Everything you need, which includes playing area setup, should be provided for the player to quickly set up the playing area, assemble their force mix, deploy initial forces, and possess a clear victory condition and game length, which allows players to end the game with a clear winner and loser. Now that certainly covers historical battles, but now you may ask, what about players who do not wish to reproduce a historical conflict and want some form of points-based game? If the points-based rules you are using allows you to have conflicts between equal force mixes, then all you really need is an army list. Players can construct their army prior to the game and arrive with their complete force mix in place. In this example, DBMM, the playing area is typically very basic, so simple rules can also be used to deploy terrain, and off you go for a game. It's actually a fairly good complete solution, assuming the force mixes can be equal. Other more simpler examples, after all, DBMM army lists, while beautiful and complete, are enormous beyond your wildest dreams. But if you look at rules such as DBM, you can quickly create force mixes on the fly. That is, you don't need to actually sit down before the game and carefully work out all your points and troops that you wish to deploy. Now in this case, the DBN system basically has 12 points per corps, and most elements are 1 point, allowing players to create, let's say, 3 corps force mixes in really just a few minutes. Now, while DBN works well when you have an equal force mix situation, this is not really a typical Napoleonic situation. Many Napoleonic battles were uneven, with reinforcements arriving at various points in the game, but as an equal force mix set of rules, the army lists in DBN work extremely well, and I find them very usable in terms of allowing me to quickly create a force mix for a game. However, when you're dealing with non-equal force mixes, one solution is to create a defense and attack force mix for each side, using a basic scenario. An example is the basic scenario I used for LWRS or Bewegunskrieg, where one player is the defender and the other is the attacker. The defender is outnumbered in the first half, and then in the second half it gets a force mix equal to the attacker force mix for a counterattack. Now this shows the Polish 1939 defence and attack force mixes. This works, but has two major issues. Your scenario document becomes very large. The World War II scenarios run into hundreds of pages covering all possible combatants and periods. The other issue is the scenario is rather basic, and after playing it a few times you pretty much exhaust its potential, even if you try different force mixes. It's a lot of work for not a lot of game, but does give you a quick way of having a game. Now, one method which one of my gaming comrades raised was to use cards for initial force mixes. I suspect the idea came from all the Euro games he plays, as he has daughters, and those types of games are very popular with him and his daughters. In this case, each player selects a card each, which provides the player with a core-size formation. The formation can be deployed at the start, at the quarter point of the game, or at the half point of the game, and points values vary according to when they come onto the playing area. Once a player has at least 48 points of force mix, he can declare he is finished. The opposing player can select one more card, and the process ends. There are other triggers for ending the card selection as well. The rules used here is a figure game version of the SPI Napoleonic War game, although this system could be used for really any set of rules. Now, once both players have declared the card selection is ended, each player then discards cards he cannot use. In some cases, a single formation has two cards with different values. The player selects which formation he wishes to use. Then, each player then allocates the cards into a start, quarter or half position, ensuring the total points never exceeds 48, or it can exceed 48, and if it should so do, then excess points are victory points for the opponent, and if you're under 48, then that's victory points for that player. Now, there are some other restrictions as well to avoid gamesmanship. In this case, the Austrian player gets the 4th and 6th Corps as his start forces. The reserve cavalry corps comes in on game turn 3. Now, in this case, the game length is 8 game turns. It's a one-day period. The game turns are 90 minutes in length, and it's autumn and spring. Now, the reserve grenadier corps and the 5th Corps then arise on game turn 5. The player with the greater start forces is the attacker, and the other player is the defender, and this affects how they deploy. There is a playing area system and a victory point system, which also in some cases use cards and in other cases uses tables and charts. Now, another critical game aid is of course the player area creation system. When you have a simple playing area, the rules to set up can be simple, such as with DBMM. When you move to large-scale Napoleonics, World War II or Cold War, the terrain becomes incredibly complex. There are two basic systems that you could sort of approach. The first is to use tables, as you can see here. Each player spins a dice, that's the attacker and defender, cross-references it, and that tells you how many water features are placed, which the defender then places. Then both players spin a dice, attacker and defender, cross-references, and that tells you how many built-up areas, hills and woods are placed in a 30 centimetre square, and there's a system where both players deploy the terrain pieces, and all the terrain pieces are a standard basic building block size. Now, this works, but it's time consuming and can result in some unusual playing areas. Now, another system is to have a number of standard playing areas, and players can decide which one they're going to use for the game. Once decided, the players then would go through the force determination, deployment and reinforcement process. I tend to prefer this system, however creating the standard playing areas to choose from is not very easy. Now, of course, one option is to use historical playing areas, that is the actual playing area or the battlefield that a historical battle occurred on. So on the left we have Eylau, on the right we have Friedland. However, many battles were rather unique, so Eylau is a reasonable playing area, but Friedland is not, unless of course you're playing that particular historical battle. I suspect someone will need to study all the battles which occurred during the Napoleonic War and then group them. So, for example, Borodino is probably rather similar to Eylau. Once grouped, you could then use these groups to create a small set of historically feasible playing areas, which could be selected using a table with a die roll or a card system. Now we come to victory conditions, and this tends to be another area which is minimised in rules or simplified to the point of not being useful, or in some cases even ignored entirely. Now, basing victories on casualty has the risk that both players will do nothing, so you'll always need geographic victory conditions. This is reasonably simple for historical battles, but for ad hoc battles where the force mixes are variable, and actually even the playing area is variable, this is not very easy. I suppose a table would need to be created where you cross-reference the force mix ratios, that is the initial force mix ratios, and create basically a geographic victory point system from this. For mobile force ratios, where the attacker outnumbers the defender a lot, then you play along the long axis, so as a result the victory points, as you can see here, are separated by a great distance. And in other cases where the attacker does not have such an overwhelming force, you play across the short axis where the victory point locations are not so distant from the, let's say, attacker's playing edge, but they're separated by horizontal or side, left and right dimensions. Now this shows a simple example with 3 objectives, in this case play along the short axis. Now you could also throw in casualties for your VP, if your rules support demoralisation or army panic, throw that in as well. As that could also be a clear VP trigger, or at least a trigger to end the game. And so we come to the end of my video, in this case part 36 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos. In this case, creating, or what kind of game aids players should consider to create in order to speed up their game. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.